All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still joining the webinar, but we'll start off with our introduction. So welcome to our ICFJ IJNet Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum webinar. I'm Taylor Mulcahey. I am the managing editor of IJNet, or the International Journalist Network, which, if you aren't familiar, it's an online publication for journalists where we publish tips, tools, trends, case studies, and a bunch of opportunities for journalists. And these are all available in 8 languages. For today's webinar, we're joined by Luba Kassova, an audience strategy expert and co-founder and director of audience strategy consultancy, AKAS. So this year, Kassova and her team worked on research that examined women as sources of news, protagonists in news stories, cover of gender equality issues. So she published 2 reports this year. One, The Missing Perspectives of Women in COVID-19 News, which examines women in coverage of the pandemic specifically, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but we're really going to focus on the bigger report, which is The Missing Perspectives of Women in News, which just looks at news across the spectrum. I will share links to those in the chat, as well as a couple of links so you can find more about Luba. Today she's going to present her findings, and rather than just leaving you with this sad snapshot at the end, we also want to make sure that we dive into her recommendations and strategies for better inclusion that she includes in the report, and we're going to go over some of those practical measures now. So just to give everyone an idea of how this will happen, we're going to pass it over to Luba for about 15-20 minutes for a presentation. You can see her slides here. And then I'm going to do a few questions, and then we're going to turn it over to questions from you. So definitely use the chat if you have any links or things to share, and then you can use the Q&A function to ask questions for the Q&A part of the webinar. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Luba to give us a presentation of her findings of the women and the missing perspectives of women in news.
Thank you so much, Taylor, for your great introduction and for having me here today. It's really an honor to be able to present the insights and the recommendations from the missing perspectives of women in the news. Before I start, I just wanted to share a quote that I find incredibly beautifully very eloquent and beautifully made, makes the case for why it's really important to hear women's voices. It's by Rebecca Solnit, the American writer and feminist. Who is heard and who is not defines the status quo. By redefining whose voice is valued, we redefine our society and its values. So a little bit about the reports. As Taylor said, there are 2 reports that came out. The one on COVID came out in September last year, and The Missing Perspectives of Women in News in December. And I would highly recommend that you look at them both because they're really complementary. The one about COVID really dives into the coverage of women with respect to the biggest story potentially of our lifetimes, whereas The Missing Perspectives of Women in News looks at the issue of women's underrepresentation more structurally and takes a historical view. And this is the one that I'm going to be focusing on today. The reports were commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in support of the Gender Equality Forum convened by UN Women. There are 4 indicators that my team in AKAS and I looked at for measuring representation of women in the news. The first one is around the proportion of women in newsrooms and in news leadership. The second one is the proportion of women who features experts in the news and sources. The third indicator is the proportion of women who features protagonists in news stories. And the final indicator is around the proportion of news story coverage that contains a gender equality angle within the story. Before I dive in, I just want to make a point that the reports, both of them, but this one I'm focusing on the big report, is really, really well researched and rests on giant shoulders of reports written by academics, institutes, non-for-profit organizations, multilateral organizations. And a big part, the backbone of the report is based on the content analysis of 57 million stories that was delivered by Media Ecosystems Analysis Group, of looking at 12,000 publications in 6 countries: India, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, UK, and US. The AKAS team looked at almost 2,300 academic articles to understand what academics have written, as well as more than 200 databases surveys. And I have built, wherever possible, the narrative for 3 different audiences: the public, opinion formers, of whom journalists are one, and decision makers in countries. Here is the story in a nutshell. If there is one point for you to remember from today, it is this, the first one. News is produced mainly by men. In the 21st century, it features more men and is consumed more by men. It's largely a men's affair. And that's the case universally across all the countries that we analyzed. Women's share of quoted voice in news is marginalized. And very importantly, no substantive progress, surprisingly, has been achieved in the last decade or 2. Underneath that, this is underpinned by persistent patriarchal values that operate across the global south, but also the global north, and result in gender equality polemic largely being absent from the news. However, there is a silver lining. There are many solutions, and the report contains 50 recommendations and a checklist across the of solutions that can be applied across the news value chain. And what's important to understand is that in order to achieve progress, there is a need to work on systemic level, on organizational level, and on individual level. The good news, before we dive into the sobering results, I would like to say that there is actually good news, and the 6 countries which we analyzed all provide examples of areas of excellence. For example, South Africa leads in terms of gender equality legislation and also proportion of women in newsrooms. The UK and US lead in terms of social norms and attitudes that are more favorable to gender equality. And Kenya, India, Nigeria, and South Africa lead in terms of journalists, pro-change attitudes, their willingness to move the causes forward. So I shall present 6 challenges to you that are very much represent the bedrock of the report and build the picture of what's actually happening. Firstly, the proportion of women in newsrooms remains flat in the 21st century across all the countries, and women leaders are a minority. On this slide, you'll see many dots. Each of these dots represents a year, starting from 1998 to 2020, and each color represents a country, and they show the proportion of women in newsrooms. Whilst I don't expect you to go into the detail of it, I just encourage you to look visually and to see how flat, more or less, the lines are. So there is really no discernible growth having been noticed, registered rather. Here we're measuring the red, in red is the proportion of women in top level management in different countries, and in pink is the proportion of women in governance in news organizations. And you can see that women are minority in all the countries. And in fact, globally, Only 26% of people in governance in news organizations are women, and only 27% in top management. The ICFJ kindly shared the results from the State of Technology in Global Newsroom survey that was conducted in 2019. And what that showed us is that globally, women remain to this a minority in newsrooms and in news management structures. For example, 39% of women, newsroom journalists and managers are women, and actually only 33% are managers. Second challenge is that women's share of quoted voice in news remains marginalized. The content analysis that Meg delivered showed, and just to help you visually navigate the slides, red is women and orange is the color that we've chosen for men. And you can see that women are between 2 and 6 times less likely to be quoted as experts, sources, or protagonists in 2019 than men in the 6 countries which we analyzed. Now this is looking at protagonists, the proportion of men and women who are protagonists in news stories in the analyzed countries in 2015. It's based on the Global Media Monitoring Project, and it shows that women were between 2 and 5 times less likely to appear as protagonists in news stories than men. Now, when we fast forward to 2019, based on the content analysis, we see that the gap has indeed increased, and women are between 3 and 6 times less likely to appear as protagonists in the news than men. And actually, this is data that was I record. It's 2019, the whole of 2019 analysis of news coverage. So it's actually before COVID happened, and when the COVID story broke, actually this proportion has gone down further, and that's a really important point. This slide compares the proportion of women in lower single house in parliament in each of the countries. These are the red dots, and the gray dots is the percentage of protagonists in political coverage who are women. The reason we wanted to compare the two is because often journalists say, rightly, that there is a real structural problem whereby more men's voices are amplified in different spheres of society, which is true. So we wanted, AKAS team wanted to test to what extent journalism contributes with additional male bias or reflects society as it is, or indeed whether it does journalism does better news coverage. And what we found very interestingly is that in South Africa, the UK, USA, and Kenya, there is an additional male bias that is overlaid by news coverage, whereby there are more women in politics that are featured in the news. In India, it's reverse. More women are featured in news than in politics, but it's from a very small base, 17% versus 13% of all protagonists. And in Nigeria, the news coverage trails the proportion of women in politics. It's 6%, very low. Today, women are between 3 and 5 times less likely to appear as protagonists in the news than men. I think I made that point. Oh, sorry. I think I'm going backwards. Okay, so the third challenge is the fact that coverage of gender equality issues is virtually absent from the news. So the content analysis of 57 million stories across all the countries based on 12,000 publications revealed that less than 1% of all news coverage in 2019 across any of the countries analyzed contained an element of gender equality in it. The fourth challenge is that news is consumed more by men. Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism publishes digital news reports every year. And you can see here the red circles is the proportion of women who say that they're extremely or very interested in news, and the orange is the proportion of men. And consistently, globally, and in the countries where data was available from the our markets of interest, show that men are more likely to be extremely or very interested in the news than women. So conventional argument suggests that, and what's conventionally known to be true is that the view that women are less interested in news, therefore they consume less news. But actually, I think there is a lot of value in testing the hypothesis whether women consume less news because the news offers by news providers don't tailor for their needs as well as they tailor for men's needs. The fifth challenge is that gender equality is not a priority for decision makers or for journalists for that matter. A survey in 2019 of experts around the globe revealed that that gender equality is in their in their bottom three priorities of most urgent goals. And the situation is very similar when looking at surveys of media opinion formers. And finally, the sixth challenge, perhaps the most important, that underpins all the other challenges, is the fact that patriarchal values are still alive and kicking, both in the global south, but also in the global north. UNDP released a Gender Social Norms Index in March 2020, which showed extraordinary level of anti-women bias across globally, as well as in the countries that we analyzed. You can see here that the majority of members of the public in the UK and US hold at least one bias that favors men over women. And in South Africa, India, Nigeria, almost all of the population does. And where the situation becomes really complex and unfortunate is that a large proportion, either minority or majority in the case of India, of members of the population agree that when it comes to giving women equal rights with men, things have gone far enough, so success has been achieved. And why this is problematic is that if the population and decision makers don't think something is broken, then it can't be fixed. And the most upsetting stat that I wrote about in the report, and I remember discussing at length with my children over dinner one evening, is the fact that a majority of the population in Nigeria and a significant minority in South Africa and India, and about 1 in 10 in the UK and US believe that it's actually justifiable for a man to beat his wife. Finally, this slide is really interesting because what we did, the AKAS team that I worked with, we tested the hypothesis. We wanted to see whether there is a relationship between a more or less biased society against women and how likely women are, and women featuring in the news. And what we found, and I should really say that 5 data points is not enough to be definitive about it, but it's enough to get an indication that the more biased a population is against women, the less likely women are to feature in the news. And this makes the case of the need for systemic intervention very, very strong. So I shall only touch upon recommendations as part of this presentation, but I hope we can go into that in more detail during the Q&A. So the first point that I want to make is that the change cycle in gender equality progression in news is very complex. Because the problem is so deep and so wide, in order to achieve success, there is a need to tackle system-level factors, organizational factors, and individual journalist behaviors. And if at any point or any level there is a barrier and blockage, then we are witnessing flatlining, which has happened in the 21st century. And in fact, there is a danger that things can go backwards. And a COVID pandemic has really heightened that danger. And secondly, I wanted to share with you that the types of interventions that I've talked and written about in the report aim to change culture and people's behavior fall into three categories. The first one is increasing awareness of the fact that there is a strong anti-women biases in society, in newsrooms, in organizations. The second group is finding ways of removing barriers for advancing gender equality. And the third one is around interventions that stimulate creating new habits or new initiatives or new ways of thinking. Finally, before I finish this presentation, I want to leave you with a quote that I find incredibly empowering by the Nigerian-American writer and feminist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Culture does not make people, people make culture. So I hope we can all feel that by making a difference ourselves, we create ripple effect in society and change can happen. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Luba, for sharing the slides and stuff. And like you said, I'm sure we'll get more into a lot of that. Just a reminder for everyone watching, we're going to do about 10 to 15 minutes of my own questions, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So put any questions that you have in the Q&A function in the, down at the bottom of your screen, and we'll definitely take a look at those. So yeah, so one thing I wanted to ask you about, and you started mentioning it, is that you show that the data reveals like some pretty, that people really retain patriarchal ideologies in all the countries that you've analyzed. And that is obviously hindering growth in this area. But if society is holding these biases, like what role do you see the news industry having? Do you see the news industry having a role in changing these ideas that, persist?
That is such a good question, and one that I suspect will generate a lot of debate within the journalist community. And I will share my personal opinion, but before I do that, I just want to outline that actually it is really, really important for journalists to decide whether they choose to reflect society as it is, or whether they think they should challenge inequality, whether it's gender or racial, through the work that they do. And that's the key really question to ask. And we're increasingly seeing that there is, actually there is the Worlds of Journalist study showed a really interesting difference between journalists from the global north and journalists from the global, I'm so sorry, from the global south. So they were asked to agree or disagree with certain values, and what became apparent that all journalists are very keen to report on truth, whether they're from regardless of the region they're in. However, there was a really interesting distinction that journalists from the global south were more likely to see their role as change agents to promote tolerance in society or to influence public opinion than journalists in the UK and US. So it sounds like there is really there are different cultures that tolerate different. I'm so sorry. I'm using my husband's computer, so I don't even know how to change that.
No worries. I think we're all used to that at this point after, you know.
So, and there are it's really important, in my view, the distinction between journalism and activism is getting smaller and smaller, because we live in really polarized times where we can't take anything for granted, least of all democracy. For example, the climate change story is an example how the two are collapsing into one. Journalists also become activists. So my personal view is that journalism should lead society, should be ahead of society, and journalists should not, for example, in the COVID story, in the UK, in England, the Daily Committee, which is, the Daily Committee is made up of 100% government committee of men. And I would argue that journalists should hold people in power to account. Why is that the case, rather than take it to face value and just go with it? So these are the difficult questions that journalists should be asking, really.
Yeah, I think that gives like a really great overview of kind of understanding that division and how journalists have to make that decision for themselves as well, especially as we talk about this. And I think that will be important kind of to set the framework for as we move into talking about solutions, which I kind of want to do now. And I know in one of your reports, you include like a checklist for, you know, different solutions that we can use. Can you kind of introduce us to that checklist? Tell, you know, everyone where to find that, and give just kind of a brief overview of what that's really looking at and why you included that.
Of course. Shall I share my screen to walk you through them, or would you rather I just talk?
Sure, I think that's probably helpful if we have the visual, and I don't think we need to go through all of it, but definitely if you show us where we can find it and walk through some of it, I think that'll be huge.
Sure, I shall do that. Just to start off, whilst I'm looking, the checklist is made up of 20 points. It's really rigorously researched. And it follows the news value chain. So there are recommendations around how to dedicated to organizational resources, how to bring more women in news leadership, and also how to retain women in journalism who are actually more likely to leave at any level of the organization. And here we're talking about things like introducing suite of policies that have shown to really lead to success, such as obviously equal pay, but also parental leave and childcare assistance, flexible working, which is particularly important for women who are still seen and are the primary carers in the family, addressing gender bias in recruitment, which exists, and having policies about returning to work after career break, policies around sexual harassment, and so on and so forth. Another really important one is actually tackling gender blindness through ongoing training, gender sensitivity training across all levels of the organization, not just in newsrooms, but actually also having training for boards and for management is really important. Then the next set of recommendations look at news gathering and how to improve and increase the proportion of women in news gathering. And really important, absolutely critical thing to do is to actually raise awareness of the existing bias, because very frequently journalists are not aware that actually their coverage really favors men as sources, experts and protagonists. And there is a project, BBC 50/50 project, which has shown great results, and many organizations are now using their services. But interestingly, what happened is when journalists started counting, and what you do is you just manually count the proportion of men and women in the coverage that you produce, they were invariably surprised about the lower proportion of women that their coverage contains, contrary to their expectations. Then the next set of recommendations is around news outputs. And that is, what are the different, how to create a women-centered coverage that will feature more women-centered stories that are more likely then to be picked up by policymakers, and also stories that are more relevant to women, that reflect their worries, their hopes, as well as how to ensure that the women who are portrayed in the coverage are not just victims or sexual objects or primary caregivers, but also they're power brokers, they are more empowered. So this is the next set of recommendations. And finally, looking at news consumptions and measuring news impact. So what we found when we did the deep dive into this area is that the data is incredibly patchy. It was so difficult to build a coherent historical picture of what's happening, because there's simply data at a global level doesn't exist, and often at a country level it doesn't exist. And that is also related to the low priority of gender issues that's been given, and ultimately to the upholding of patriarchal values. So in terms of news consumption, what I'm recommending is to disaggregate audience news consumption data by sex, so that news providers can see the difference in the consumption and interest in the needs of men and women. And I've worked with many news providers as an audience expert, and very rarely do I see news providers actually looking at the data by gender, by sex. And finally, news impacts. In order to understand how news impacts society, it's really important to track the impact of news coverage on women who consume it, on decision makers who take the decisions, on journalists, and on society at large. So this is broadly, these are the categories broadly that are covered in the checklist. And I'm happy to go into them in more detail, or any of them, if that's helpful, of course.
Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for giving that outline. I just want to remind everyone that you can find that at the end of the full report, The Missing Perspective of Women in News. And I'm just sharing that in the chat right now, so everyone can find that. So I have a couple more questions, but before we do, I just noticed a few people asking about one specific question that I wanted to have us address just really quick right now. So you mentioned that, the 6 countries that you're focused on, and keep showing that data. But a few people are just asking questions about, why you focus on those 6 countries.
Sure. So the decision, the 2 reports that were written were turned around in 5 months. So there was a very quick turnaround to do this. And the COVID wasn't even planned, of course, but we felt that we had to do it, given the importance that it holds for society. So the decision was made that the countries that were needed, that were chosen, had to be English speaking, because content analysis had to be done in one language rather than many. And the second criteria was that they cover as many continents as possible and cultures. So the 6 countries cover 4 continents and cultures from the global south and the global north, as well as I said, different continents. So that's the rationale for choosing those 6. But very often when you read the report, you will see that where possible, when we've interrogated other data sets like ICFJ's survey, for example, and many others, we've also looked at the global figures and juxtaposed those with the countries to see whether there is a big discrepancy, and there never was. There really, it seemed that these countries gave a good representation of how things are moving in news.
Yeah, thanks. I hope that like helps, you know, everyone kind of understand where that decision came from. And obviously in an ideal world, we look at every country, but I feel like that wouldn't have been turned around in 5 months. So, all right. So yeah, I just have, I'm gonna ask one more question here. I'm gonna kind of combine 2 into 1, and then I'll turn it over to the audience questions. Yeah, so there's a couple things that maybe are practical barriers to people who want to create change in their newsroom. So a couple of questions is, you know, what would you say to journalists who are journalists, editors, newsroom managers who are being asked to do more with less, right? We see funding cuts kind of across the board, especially in, you know, coming out of COVID, or still in it. And you know, how do you respond to that? Like if it's a resource issue where people are saying, oh, this just seems like one more thing we have to like consider and change, or we can't even keep up with news production. And then I'm gonna just ask one more and then you can answer them together. And then also, what would you say to journalists who are maybe like staffers who don't have a ton of power in the newsroom, who need to then therefore manage up or convince their, you know, superiors in the newsroom that this is something that they need to care about? So 2 kind of barriers, and how would you recommend addressing those?
Thank you. These are great questions. I guess the first thing to say is, if there is no intrinsic motivation among journalists that this is an inequality that jars with them, then it's very hard to convince them. So it's really important that they see the value and the importance of reflecting the views and the perspectives of women. So that's the first point to make. Secondly, it's really important to help them spend as little time as possible developing new habits, because journalists are notoriously very time poor. And this is where behavioral science really comes into play, where there are certain interventions that have been implemented around the world, starting usually from Scandinavia, that has shown a lot of promise. And one of them is, so we know that there is a real bias at using protagonists, and that's gone for many decades, protagonists who are men, and sources and experts. So one of the things that shows real promise is to actually create databases for journalists in newsrooms of women experts in various fields that enable them to very quickly dip and find the right person, rather than look for their own. So that's one way of doing it. And actually, I have my favorite example is from South China Morning Post, who actually launched this initiative whereby they ask their readers, their collaborators, and their staff, everyone, to nominate women that are experts in various areas. And they created an incredible database. They then obviously verified their credentials, and they even now have women who are experts in nanotechnology and all sorts of areas. So that's one way forward. Another intervention that really helps is to have like cheat sheets where it's journalists, and I know that many journalists have slight aversion to checklists. So the creative challenge is how to present them in a way that doesn't jar with journalists. But if that barrier was circumvented, then this cheat sheet could show, okay, these are the relevant angles to women, these are the relevant worries that they have, these are their needs, and this is how you could approach a story potentially if women were to be to be reflected better in news coverage. Another idea, actually all this is underpinned though by the need to have a champion. Usually what happens in newsrooms is that someone champions from the bottom up, so grassroots initiatives are created, and then it's really important that someone in the leadership, at least one or the whole leadership team, is on board, because if they're not, I'll be honest, it's a very hard sell. And if also there isn't any grassroots initiatives, it's unsustainable. So there is this newspaper, and actually what the case studies that I'm showing are from the gender, let me remember, the one IFRA's gender equality checklist, I think it is, gender balance index. I can send the exact title. So they've published lots of case studies of success, and one which really stayed with me is the Spanish, actually a daily Catalan newspaper called ARA, launched, 3 people in the newsroom took on top of their daily job, launched this initiative which aimed to provide coverage for women by women, relevant to women. And what they did is they asked regularly their colleagues in newsrooms whether they've created stories that are relevant to women. And by doing this is really clever, because not only did they actually produce initiatives and newsletter and actually online brand that's specifically for women, but by asking regularly their colleagues, they helped everyone start thinking about that dimension a lot more. So these are various ways of addressing the issue of basically passion is needed, and tools which make it really easy. These are the 2 things that are needed. Did I answer the second part of your question?
Yeah, I think definitely you know, we're giving recommendations that can be used in kind of in both facets to make this process easier or more applicable, or, you know, that makes it practical and doesn't seem like, oh, just fix gender in your newsroom. But, you know, we can start to really break it down. I think that's just the biggest thing. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to some audience questions now. So the first one here is, would gender quotas be a possible tool to improve women's representation in newsrooms? Yeah, what would you say to that? It's the idea of quotas.
Well, I personally think, because unfortunately we haven't seen enough success in the 21st century, and the progress has flatlined, and it can't seem to, at the country level, certainly, I'm sure there are many newsrooms where there is parity, but at the country level, the 30% seems to be the glass ceiling. I actually think it would be a good idea to do that, to introduce quotas, or at the very least policies, recruitment policies that aim to take the bias out in recruitment, and enable women to progress. One of the key barriers for women progressing to leadership levels is the fact that there is inadequate support for them as primary caregivers in terms of flexible working or childcare, and that drives them out of the profession altogether. So if this hygiene factors are sorted, then we can see women progressing. But where quotas really help is addressing that patriarchal barrier, the subtle gender blindness at best, or gender discrimination at worst. If there is endorsement at very high level, okay, we're actually going to put targets against this, it's shown to really work. In fact, there is there is Lusaka Sun in Zambia. There 70% of their employees and reporters, as well as senior reporters, are women, because they took the strategic decision that that's what they were going to do.
All right. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting what you brought up, is it's not only getting women into the newsroom, it's keeping them there and helping them progress. And I think that, you know, is huge. All right, so here's another question. So have you, so do you have any recommendations or research on how audience engagement can be tailored by gender? So, you know, how, aside from just selecting topics that women are interested in or care about, and, you know, selecting what types of news we're covering, you know, are there any other formats or ways to reach women audiences?
One of the key things that doesn't seem to be happening, and actually we mustn't underestimate the importance of tailoring stories that you've just listed. It's incredibly important to do, and very often organizations don't know what their female audiences want because they don't measure the performance, or they don't ask them surveys. So that's really a baseline that would get news providers very far ahead competitively. But another thing that really can help is, I forgot what I was saying. Oh, I'm very sorry. I have blank mind, but
no worries.
Different question, and then I'll come back to this one.
Okay, yeah, we can do another one here. And it's kind of, so this one is from someone who's watching on Facebook. So do you have any data or information on the difference in audience when a woman is the author, anchor, source of the news? So you know, if we have, I think the question is kind of, if we have women producing the news who are, you know, their byline or their, you know, the anchor, does that affect then who's watching it?
Yes, so I'll answer the first question because I just remembered my example, and then I'll come back to this one. So
Perfect.
One of the things that we discovered through the analysis of the portrayal analysis that AKAS did of the COVID coverage is that there is very strong bias towards reporting hard facts without attaching them to human interest stories. And there is a problem with that twofold. One is there is danger of the coverage being desensitized and dehumanized amid this sea of suffering by so much death. But the second also issue is that women actually are more likely to be hooked in if there is a human interest angle within stories, and that very often is missing. So introducing more human interest frames on which to hang facts. I'm not saying it's either or, not at all, but it's hanging facts onto someone such that we don't just connect with their heads, but also with the hearts of the readers. And with the viewers through helping them feel emotional connection. So that's another way that can really help female audiences. Another thing actually is that women are more interested in men in local aspects of coverage and also in solutions-based journalism. They are looking for, because women tend to report more anxiety, generally higher levels of anxiety. They are seeking for coverage that will provide solutions as well. So that's another thing that can be ramped up. And at the moment, it's very marginal. Mm-hmm. The coverage is very biased towards negative angles and rather than solutions. So to go back to what was your second question?
Yeah, definitely. So the second question is, does it affect?
Oh, yes, anchors.
You have a woman producing the news.
Yeah, so there is a lot of academic research written on this. And there is disagreement to what extent having women who are, for example, in leadership roles or editors, leads to more balanced coverage. To more gender balanced coverage and more women-centered coverage. And actually, there literally is inconclusive, the research. Some authors and academics say that there is link, and others show that there isn't. What we did with the in the reports is looking at the proportion, whether there was a correlation between the proportion of women in newsrooms and in news leadership, and then the proportion of women who are protagonists in the news or experts. And we saw that there wasn't a link, that even newsrooms such as in South Africa, where there is almost gender parity has been achieved, the proportion of women protagonists and experts is very low. So there doesn't seem to be correlation. So we're not necessarily seeing, but there is some other content analysis in academics who have shown that women tend to have more focus on empathy, on focus around emotions, that at a management level, women are more likely to be collegiate rather than competitive with each other. But there is a sense, and one of the key arguments made is that newsrooms tend to be because they're dominated by men, the culture is more masculine, and women is considered that they are more likely to trade off their gender identity for their professional identity and to adapt to more masculine way of making news. And that is seen as being one barrier to seeing difference in their coverage.
Yeah, thank you. I've definitely read a little bit about, kind of understanding both sides of that. So I think that gives kind of an overview of at least what the research is showing us now. So yeah, so we're almost out of time, which is honestly, this was just not enough time to cover everything about gender equity in the newsroom, apparently. But I think this gave us a really great snapshot of of your findings. I really hope that, I want to let everyone know, if you're interested in learning more, I definitely recommend digging into those reports. I'll share an IJNet story we did on one of the COVID specific report, but definitely check those out for more. And also, if you missed something, you want to share this webinar, obviously we threw a lot of data at you and you want to save those things, we will be putting the recording up on IJNet's YouTube page. And then we'll write a webinar recap that will be up in the next few days as well. So definitely you can come back to this and share it widely. All right, well, thank you so much, Luba. I don't know if there's any kind of final remarks you want to give to the audience. Is there anything you want to leave us with before we sign off here?
I just wanted to highlight one of the chapters very quickly, which I co-wrote with Richard Addy, who is the co-founder of AKAS, and it's on alternative narratives for change, which I really recommend for journalists to read. And that looks at how to make the case compelling to newsroom leaders that it's important to bring audiences in. And the business case, for example, is really strong. The fact that being relevant to women is more likely to help with business models that are essentially breaking down at the moment. So that's something to consider, and that's not something we touched upon, but I think it's really interesting and innovative way of thinking, so I'd recommend that people look. And my last point is, if anyone feels that they have a question, I'm very happy to, if they email me, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Yeah, great. Yeah, can you where can we find you if we're interested in learning more or want to get in touch with you? Where could, the viewers?
So on my email and Twitter and on LinkedIn. I can send, actually on the presentation, there are all the details.
Awesome.
But I can also send them to you and you can then forward it. I don't know what the system is, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you guys know where to find us, so that's perfect. Great. Well, thank you so much, Luba. Thank you everyone who was here to watch. Just so everyone knows, the ICFJ IJNet Global Health Crisis Reporting Forum, we hold webinars every week on a wide range of topics related to the pandemic, and this group is available in English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Arabic. So if you haven't joined the Facebook group yet, definitely do so. I'm putting a link in the chat actually right now so you can learn more. And someone asked about the recording, and I believe it will be available on there as well, because this has been live on Facebook and you can see that even sooner. So yeah, definitely check out that link and get more involved with our forum webinars. And like Luba said, get in touch with us at IJNet or with Stella from the Health Forum, and we can point you in the direction if you have any questions. So thank you to everyone who joined today. Thank you, Luba. Great. And everyone have a good one and stay safe. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.